Well, hello, my friends. Guess what? The United States is now also involved in Ecuador. Oh, I swear to God, we are like a quarter into 2026 and things do not want to slow down at all. Yes, my friends, while much of the media focus at present is on the Middle East, there have been continued developments in the Eastern Pacific Basin that do, of course, demand our attention once again. So, today we're going to be catching up on just what has been going on in Central and Southern America after news broke that American commandos in recent days joined Ecuadorian troops in a joint mission aimed at dismantling a suspected criminal hub operated by an alleged narco-terrorist organization along the country's coast. Because yes, that happened. Now, going back slightly so you'll understand what it is that I'm talking about here, in early March, the United States and Ecuador would launch joint military operations against designated terrorist organizations in the South American country amidst the U.S. military's unilateral strikes against boats in the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific that were, of course, accused by the Trump administration of smuggling drugs. Strikes against suspected drug smuggling boats began in September 2025, which at this point has resulted in at least 47 strikes, killing around 163 people. In this case, though, we are talking about American forces actually getting involved, and the operation, dubbed Lanza Marina, focused on a compound believed to serve as a staging ground for high-speed boats linked to Los Choneros, which is a powerful Ecuadorian criminal organization, according to two U.S. officials who spoke under condition of anonymity because, of course, at this point, they're not actually authorized to speak publicly. So more information on this, I'm sure, is going to be coming out gradually as time goes on. So that is happening. And because of that, I would like to focus today on Ecuador, on what has been going on, how it is that we got here, and most importantly, how current events are continuing to reshape the relationship between Ecuador and the United States in 2026. But, of course, you all know how things work here on the History of Everything. In order to really get an understanding of what's going on here, we're going to need to really take a regional and long-term view of the situation, and that is something that requires a lot of context. After all, the history of drug cartels and efforts to enforce them, or enforce laws against them, I guess you could say, that is something that is defined by its cyclical nature and international origin. Developments by cartels in one region will inevitably lead to changes in enforcement, which might displace another aspect of cartel organizations, which requires yet another stage of evolution. It's constantly changing as time goes on. Additionally, the international nature of cartels, aided by the permeability of many of South America's more rugged borderlands, means that any interdiction efforts must also be international to have any hope of succeeding, because otherwise there's just no real way to enforce things along borders.
It's like, are you here? I guess you probably didn't expect me to interrupt things like this. I do apologize. But I had to interrupt things here right now because I'm sure a lot of you are aware that I lead group travel trips overseas. And what is going on right now with Trovo, which is the company that I actually go through a lot here for my travel, is they're having a really big sale where it is that you are getting an additional $200 off any of my trips. And that applies to Croatia, which is literally about to close. So if you want to join us for that here this summer, you need to get on it now. Or if you want to join me in the Baltic to see some Christmas markets and castles and other things like that in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, you can join me there. Or, and I don't have a picture of it yet, this next year, we're also going to be going to China, so you can join me on an adventure there. Besides that, if you don't want to join me on any adventures, but you still want to support me, and I do really appreciate that, you can check out my merch. We just released a new shirt, the Gladbod, which has a historically accurate gladiator body on it, and that is the true Dad Gladbod of history.
As it is right now, my friends, the current ecosystem of international cartels is the result of the often intersectional nature of politics and the drug trade in the Americas. Governments and dissident groups alike have participated historically to varying degrees in the trade, with its proceeds oftentimes being used to fund their political agendas, whether legit or illegitimate. Both are actually applicable here. And so understanding the history of the drug trade, how cartels operate that trade, and the influence that they can exert, that is going to be critical to getting the full picture of this issue from a more regional viewpoint. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to need historical context, and we need to really come to grips with the overall concept of the cartels and how they operate. In part, this gives us an idea of why these organizations are so hard to combat with traditional national level police resources. And more importantly, it's going to give us an idea as to why these organizations developed the way that they did throughout their histories. Additionally, we're going to have to get into the whole cartel versus narco-terrorism debate, as is seen through a law enforcement and military perspective, because that is something that has been a little bit contentious, I would say, for the past half a year or so. It's complicated. It really is. And so, without further ado, my friends, let's go ahead and dive in and start exploring this context. First up, from the very beginning, I wanted to start with the structure and operations of a cartel. I know that for the purpose of this video, we're going to be focusing on Ecuador here today, but a general overview on cartels will help you, the viewer, to understand things significantly better. There are many unique iterations of cartel structures. Whether we are talking about things from Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel to the more modern Sinaloa and Jalisco new generation cartels, which we actually did previous videos on, all of these different variations make it hard to approach these organizations with a framework that really allows us to understand them not just as criminal enterprises, but as connected series of businesses that act almost similar to militarized multinational corporations. That is probably actually one of the closest comparisons you could make. So, for the sake of this video, we're going to approach the cartels and narco-terrorism organizations with a more unified definition. While certain unique aspects of individual structures might be lost in the discussion, yes, when and if it is necessary to discuss these unique elements, we'll try and discuss them and explain what kind of effects this departure from the definition might actually have. But for the sake of brevity, we need to look at things from a more 10,000-foot view. So we may lose some nuance in specific stages of the cartel's production and distribution cycle, but what's more important is that we have a good idea of how these things generally happen. In broad terms, a cartel is a complex and international network of suppliers, processors, distributors, and logistics operators that span from the cultivation or acquisition of precursor materials, those are the things that you need to actually make the narcotics, and then extending often as far as street-level dealers thousands of miles away. But in addition to the more obvious economic aspects of cartels, there is a need for power or influence to protect or expand interest, to prevent competition, or protect from international enforcement. These political aims are often reinforced by the threat of, or carrying out of, violence in order to be able to achieve them. And in some instances, the cartels can directly challenge local governments, with varying degrees of success. I'm sure you all can think of instances on the news in the last decade where tensions between countries and the cartels would go to the point of violence, with the killing of El Mencho just a few weeks ago and us having done a video on that being probably the most recent example of this. Anyway, the first step for the cartels is to procure a supply or precursor chemicals that are needed to manufacture narcotics. This is perhaps one of the murkier aspects of the cartel's operations, due in large part to the mixture of willing and unwilling participants in this stage of the process. A cartel can do this in a variety of different ways, as supplies from chemicals can be skimmed or outright diverted from legitimate sources. Farmers could be provided with seeds, companies could be provided with capital, and other support could be provided by the cartels. There's an infinite number of things that could be done, but it is important to note here that there is not a strong consensus on if the growers and the suppliers are directly members of the cartel structure, but at the very least, they are seen as affiliated. Now, these suppliers in large part function effectively as contractors, supplying goods for a fixed price, just with the slightly more coercive element in their job where a gun could be held to their head if they refuse, or they could be given big wads of cash, a lot more than they otherwise could make. That's the situation for a lot of people to get involved in this. If the structure of the cartel is to be seen as a kind of pyramid, this is the broad base due to the large number of individuals, especially farmers, that are impacted by cartel interests. In the El Oro region of Ecuador, over 95% of farms are thought to be facing some form of extortion by criminal elements. That is ridiculously high, and over 40% of farms nationwide in Ecuador are facing similar conditions. So if you're in El Oro, chances are, not just 9 times out of 10, but 19 times out of 20, you are going to be in some kind of situation with the criminals, whereas in other parts of the country, it's 4 out of 10, and that's still ridiculously high. These farmers, regardless of their actual affiliation, provide a significant agricultural base for the cartels. For example, across the border from Ecuador in Colombia and Peru, the countries have hundreds of square miles under cultivation for plants that are used in the creation of narcotics. Peru has around 350 square miles under production for coca, and Colombia has around 975. After the cultivation stage comes the creation and packaging of narcotics for transport and then later sale. And this is also when we see involvement change from more affiliates of the cartel to involved specialists, because there is a lot of technical and chemical knowledge that is actually required in order to ensure consistent and efficient production of narcotics. Oftentimes, this coming from a more decentralized network of agents among smaller labs and processing centers in order to prevent a large disruption in the event that, there's a raid by law enforcement, an international agency, or even rival cartels that could get involved. To give you an example of the large presence of these labs, after his election in 2022, Colombian President Gustavo Petro would go and change his country's approach on cartels from targeting the coca plants that serve as the raw material for cocaine to an approach that targeted production labs. Over the course of the last 4 years of this plan, the country has destroyed over, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this number, 18,000 labs. Not 1,800, 18,000. But still, it has an ever increasing amount of the drug made, as evidenced by the large and expanding coca production. So even with all of these labs being targeted, there are still more. And there are probably more than when it is that they had started destroying them in the first place, or they are larger and producing more because that much more product is being developed. It is a really big problem. Now, from here, the narcotics are packaged for transport to their distribution markets, with transportation ranging from bulk amounts that are moved through methods of traditional shipping, in addition to the more recognizable smuggling operations like off-book flights, small craft vessels, and even pseudo-submarines that are aptly named narco-subs. Yeah, this step is perhaps the most vulnerable for the cartels within their production and distribution cycles, due to the large concentration of drugs in one place for transport. For example, between 2023 and 2025, between 50 and 60 narco submarines alone were seized. We're not talking along with planes, we're not talking along with regular boats or like caravans or other kinds of things. No, just from the submarines alone, this many were caught, and this resulted in 111 tons of narcotics being confiscated. The United States Coast Guard's Operation Pacific Viper would go and report that between the beginning of the operation in August of 2025 and February of 2026, they had captured over 200,000 pounds, or around 100 tons of cocaine, valued at around $450 million. Other methods of transport include overland smuggling, but this, of course, poses a much larger risk, either from the environmental effects of crossing in more remote areas to the increased scrutiny that is provided by traditional border checkpoints. In that same 2023 to 2025 window that we talked about here earlier, though, Customs and Border Protection reported over 852 tons of drugs being seized at the border. It is still something that is massive. Now, assuming these narcotics actually make it through the border and into the hands of their waiting recipients, the next stage for the cartels is to further subdivide the shipment and then to sell it to other dealers or to feed into their own network within countries. This, in and of itself, might be a topic for a later episode, so I'm going to try and be brief here as much as I can. Shipments come in, they are divided, they are distributed to subordinate organizations or affiliates. They are sold, and then the money is brought back to the organization to either launder domestically or to transfer internationally back to the cartel's main body. Now, this money might be then used to fund the lavish lifestyles we often come to expect from cartel leaders, but it can also be used to bribe officials, to pay for the next round of supply, or, in some instances, fund and supply paramilitary arms of the cartels, often beyond what local or even national bodies are able to fight against. Like, you will have cartels that will be better armed than the police. Not maybe as better armed than the military, but way better armed than the local police or National Guard forces or something similar in that local area. Like, again, it wasn't even a year ago that we saw the Mexican Jalisco New Generation Cartel release video that showed them as well equipped, if not better equipped, than their government adversaries. With this cash and equipment in hand, the political arm of the cartel then begins to take form and exert significant influence on the local, regional, and even national politics of a country. The cartels can easily exert their political influence through the intertwined nature of politics and economics, with the labor market in Southern and Central America being more volatile than other regions. This allows the cartels to offer a tempting economic incentive to join because are you going to make $100 over the course of a month growing simple wheat? Or are you going to grow stuff for us and make like $300 or $400 and then also save your family getting a bullet to the back of the head? This is something that ingrains the cartels in the local communities. From there, they can exert influence through bribes on candidates and officials, intimidation on politicians, and the use of locals and informants. Eventually, this can reach a state of partial control by the cartels, where the government institutions continue to run, just with cartel structures acting in tandem or in a superimposed structure to exert continued control over them. Now, the reason I have gone over all of this, the reason why I had to explain this whole thing instead of just diving into Ecuador immediately is because all of this was set up in order for you to understand just how bad the problem in Ecuador has gotten. Ecuador is the focus of today's episode, and this relationship is particularly visible in the ports and other zones of export, where drug smugglers were able to facilitate the significant flow of cocaine out of the country, alleviating difficulties in smuggling out of Peru and Colombia starting in the 1970s and 1980s. This corruption has also extended to almost every level of the country, with even President Daniel Naboa, which, yes, we're going to be talking about more on him in a second here, being implicated with ties to smuggling operations through his family's trading company. And this is the guy who people were predicting, or at least hoping, was trying to be the next Nayib Bukele of El Salvador. But for Ecuador and taking a harsh stance and cracking down on the gangs, there's a lot of problems. We probably need to go back into that here again. The reality is, my friends, while money is oftentimes the easiest way to exert change in the political system, it is unsurprisingly not the only tool in the toolkit. Violent acts by cartels and local gangs reached new heights, with the murder rate alone in Ecuador reaching 50.9 per every 100,000 people in 2025. That is something that is like 11 or 12 times what it is in the United States, just so you understand. And this being something that is primarily driven by violence from organized crime. Targets have included prison and law enforcement officials, mayors, and even judges. Perhaps the most public instance of cartel-fueled violence was the 2023 assassination of presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio. This being in response to his outspoken criticism of corruption, which wasn't taken over very well in Ecuador, because even if people want it, the cartels don't. This is where an important point of nuance really needs to come into play. You have heard me mention the term cartel and narco-terrorist, and I haven't really stopped to explain what it is that I mean with each of these terms, so let me go ahead and do that now. In short, the difference between a cartel and a narco-terrorist organization is its political ambitions. You see, the United States and many other nations adopt different designations for these criminal organizations to better devote resources to curtailing or disrupting their operations. A cartel may use political violence to advance or safeguard its operations, but taking over the state is not typically the main goal. While they want to be pulling the strings, they don't necessarily feel the need to sit in the office. In contrast, narco-terrorist organizations tend to use the economic gains from smuggling to underwrite their own political agenda. In South America, as an example, you have the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or in Spanish, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, often abbreviated as just FARC, which I've talked about here before, that was considered a narco-terrorist organization. And technically, these structures can change to meet the needs of the organization. For example, the Sinaloa cartel oftentimes acted as a narco-terrorist organization when trying to get leaders and significant figures released, but they remained largely focused more on just economic gain, so they're in a bit of a middle ground. While there's some legal issues that are tied up in these definitions, I think it can be harmful to silo each organization as either a cartel or a narco-terrorist organization. Rather, I think we really need to understand both the political and economic aims of the organizations as fundamentally related but expressed differently from cartel to cartel through the focus of their activities, either domestically or internationally. And overall, my friends, the thing is, cartel activity is actually on the rise. Yes, while it is impossible to know the true number of narcotics in the drug market at any one time, you can see spikes through seizure statistics of specific drugs. Like using fentanyl as an example, we can see the development and expansion of markets in the United States through the amount seized as it was smuggled in. In 2020, US Customs and Border Patrol would report just under 1,200 pounds of fentanyl seized. Just 3 years later, that number would be nearly 27,000 pounds. While the 2020 number is indicative of a low point worldwide of smuggling activity, of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on international trade, the rapid expansion of smuggling in the years after indicates extensive demand across the American drug market. So, when we think about drug smuggling and the illicit drug trade, popular imagination tends to focus on places other than Ecuador, driven part by media culture and in part by historic memory. Countries like Mexico, Colombia, Panama, all of these tend to dominate the conversation. So then, how does Ecuador seem to be a major player in the current drug smuggling ecosystem, to the point that the United States has actually launched strikes on Ecuadorian ships and more recently now on land? Well, the answer is the result of decisions made back in the 1970s and 1980s that altered the smuggling ecosystem to what it is that we know today. So now, finally armed with our definition, we need to look at the history of the drug trade in Ecuador. I know, this is something that is way further along the lines than normally what it is that I do in a lot of my other videos, but hey, again, it's important that we establish a lot of this prior context. You see, it's interesting. Ecuador was a relatively late player to the whole drug economy thing, only entering the scene in the 1970s. Originally, the country was simply used as a transshipping point, bringing precursors and finished drugs into the country, and to then send them out again to either markets in the United States or to production facilities within the region. The Medellin and the Cali cartels were the primary players, taking advantage of a relatively weak government and large swaths of remote jungle coastline to bring large amounts of goods into and out of the country. It was very easy for them to do this. Major pressure then by the United States in the beginning stages of the war on drugs would put pressure on both Colombia and Peru as key producers and distributors of the drug, namely cocaine. By the 1990s, organizations like FARC had a permanent presence in Ecuador, operating cross-border camps and supply lines, hoping at least in part to subvert detection by local governments or American agencies. However, FARC's presence would draw the attention of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or in Spanish, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, abbreviated as AUC. This would be during the 1996 to 2006 Colombian armed conflict, causing a new theater for the fight to open and making Ecuador an extension of their conflict. At its height, a concurrent surge in the presence of street gangs like Latin Kings and the subsequent involvement with the cartels in domestic logistics and security roles would further entrench criminal organizations in Ecuador. And that is something that didn't really go away. Despite ending in 2006, the Colombian conflict created the ideal conditions for a pseudo takeover of the country by criminal organizations in the early 2010s. The influx of refugees, the increasing power of organized crime, and the sudden stagnation of the Ecuadorian economy in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis left cartels in a position to exert so much control that not only did police oftentimes turn just a blind eye to their activity, but they also sometimes even helped move the drugs for and act on behalf of the cartels rather than the state. This problem would continue all the way to the present day, with over 400 police officers being removed on suspicion of corruption in 2024 alone. Yeah, not a good situation. As the 2010s progressed, the cartels would continue to develop their bases of power and influence, with violent crime rising sharply as gangs and cartels exerted more control. Despite having one of the lowest crime rates in Latin America in 2010, a decade of violence driven by organized crime would balloon this number. And I know we discussed the murder rate here earlier, but it's important that we look at the actual numbers here. In the year 2010, the rate was less than 10 per every 100,000 people, but as I said before, by 2025, that was 50.9. For comparison, Chicago, one of the most dangerous cities, and this is not for the entire country, this is one of the most dangerous cities in all of America, its murder rate was 14.6, which, yes, that is high, of course, but again, we're talking about a high concentration of things being very dangerous versus spread out across a country. Ecuador is 50.9 across the entire thing. So if you want to look at some of its most dangerous areas, it is significantly higher. Now, this situation was obviously not good, and the continued inability for Ecuador to effectively handle the cartel issue would lead to ever-increasing strain with the United States and other regional neighbors. In 1999, Ecuador had signed a 10-year agreement with the United States to allow for the use of the Manta Air Base as a key regional installation for anti trafficking operations, and that agreement would continue until after the 2007 election of Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa. Correa, hoping to reduce what he saw as American imperialism in Ecuador, opted to not renew the agreement in 2009, ending international operations from the country until eventually the United States would be allowed to return, but that would be significantly later. This agreement would, of course, end at the time that the drug problem got significantly worse in Ecuador. Surprise, surprise. As you could probably expect, this relationship would continue to sour as the United States became aware of Ecuadorian complicity, specifically Correa's, in smuggling, going so far as to expel the Ecuadorian ambassador in 2011. These accusations would loom over Correa until he went to trial, being found guilty in April of 2020 and was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his crimes. Yeah, tension would continue to define the US-Ecuadorian relations, nearly breaking down entirely after the Ecuadorians withdrew from a trade agreement with the US, claiming that the Americans were using it to blackmail them into releasing Edward Snowden. Which, yeah, I bet you didn't think that WikiLeaks was going to be a player here, did you? But yeah, WikiLeaks was how the fallout over Correa's corruption was brought to light, and Assange's extradition threats led to a near total trade breakdown in 2013. Correa rejected a US trade deal as blackmail and stated that his country's sovereignty was not for sale. It is interesting to note, however, considering later actions taken against Correa, that one of the conditions of the trade agreement was that Ecuador would step up drug suppression efforts in exchange for tariff-free imports into the United States. So yeah, it would have been something to help them if they just stopped drugs. Despite claims to the contrary, I might actually argue that these conditions might have put more pressure on Ecuador than the Assange issue did. Contemporary estimates put the total value of cocaine alone moving through Ecuador at about $2.2 billion at the time, and the overall economy was $87 billion, making it a definitively significant portion of the entire nation's economy. Now, while I think it might be overstating the argument to say that drugs were the real cause of pulling out of the trade deal, I think it's not unreasonable to think that they may have been part of the conversation. Now, these tense relations defined Ecuador's relationship with the US throughout the 2010s. Despite limited cooperation, drug interdictions continued to be a significant operation for the United States in the Pacific and the Caribbean, with on average around 600,000 pounds being seized annually between 2014 and 2018. Relations would significantly improve in 2017 with the election of Lenin Moreno, who promised to continue some popular social programs started under Correa, but to return the government to a more moderate left-leaning disposition. Moreno was able to continue improving Ecuador's relationship with the US, making the first state visit in 13 years in February of 2020 when he met with President Trump during his first term to discuss economic and security collaboration. Now, it's worth noting that these conversations happened in the wake of significant anti-austerity protests in Ecuador focused on fuel subsidies. But these conversations did mark a significant uptick in relations, regardless of why they occurred in the first place. This change in relations between the US and Ecuador also marked the beginning of a more aggressive stance towards narcotic activity in the Pacific. In the wake of the 2017 meeting, US forces were given the right to conduct drug interdiction and fishing surveillance out of San Cristobal Airport in the Galapagos Islands beginning in 2019. While early 2020 and the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic did see a marked decline in drug activity, in part due to the sudden stoppage of really most traditional methods of transportation, despite this initial disruption, smugglers soon found ways to cope with supply chain issues that appeared to plague both legal and illegal shippers of things. By 2024, the drug smuggling economy had not only recovered, but grown to move record amounts of narcotics. There is one more development that we need to discuss to bring up to the present day regarding Ecuador. In 2023, Daniel Naboa, he was elected as president of Ecuador, and running on a campaign broadly focused on economic and security reform, Naboa would win with a slim 52% margin, becoming Ecuador's youngest ever president at just 35 years old. His early administration was characterized by strong action against drug smuggling, something that would be later echoed by the second Trump administration. Almost immediately, Naboa would go and repeal previous judicial guidelines that allowed for individuals to possess limited amounts of illegal drugs without penalty. This was paired with the construction of two maximum security prisons, which faced criticism due to their locations on contested lands. This new enforcement strategy led to increased arrests and expansion of the incarcerated population, much in the same way as we had seen with El Salvador. In early 2024, Jose Adolfo Macias Villamar, better known as Fito, would escape from prison in Guayaquil, which would lead to a declaration of a state of emergency that would last 60 days. This state of emergency, paired with the designation of 22 gangs as terrorist organizations, led to a significant armed conflict, with January 9th, 2024 seeing the takeover of a TV station in Guayaquil and an increase in attacks against Ecuadorian police. In large part, this was just the beginning of a new cycle of violence within Ecuador, with neither government nor cartel forces willing to back down. By May of 2024, just 4 months after the storming of the TV station, Naboa's regime would report over 18,000 arrests being made. And while this had the immediate effect of reducing the violent crime rate, yes, other crimes like kidnapping, that still remained frequent, leaving the country in a tenuous situation at the end of 2024. And that now brings us to 2025, with the inauguration of the second Trump administration. Trump, like Naboa, quickly acted on campaign promises related to security and moved to address the influx of drugs into the United States. On Inauguration Day 2025, Trump would sign Proclamation 10886, which declared an emergency on the southern border of the U.S. In this order, the president allocated additional logistics and manpower resources to the southern border to increase interdiction efforts. This was paired with Executive Order 14157, which allowed for the designation of specific cartels as terrorist organizations, and now opening military as well as law enforcement resources to be used in attempts to disrupt or cease their operations. While the United States did not name any Ecuadorian cartels as terror organizations, their increased cooperation with Naboa and his declaration of 22 gangs as terror organizations did open the door further to American intervention in more militaristic ways at this point. From here, the first few months of the second Trump administration would see an increasingly militant set of talking points surrounding anti-cartel activity. Despite initially floating the idea for military intervention in Mexico using missiles in his first term, the idea for a return to a militaristic response to the drug problem really took shape during the 2024 campaign, up until the early months of 2025. Vowing to declare war on the cartels on the campaign trail in 2023, the first visible signs of this coming to fruition post-inauguration would occur in April of 2025. This being when Trump proposed sending troops across the border, a proposal that Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum summarily rejected. By August of 2025, these proposals had received renewed interest, though, with Trump directing the Pentagon to prepare operations against cartels, but providing no initial timeline for when these operations could actually be used. It wasn't clear when, but it was clear that the United States was preparing for a significant escalation of interdiction tactics. That is the context that would lead us into the fall. The tensions surrounding the use of these operations would continue through August until early September of 2025, when the US would go and announce its first strike as part of Operation Southern Spear. This first action, which was later revealed to be actually 2 strikes, would go and sink a vessel in international waters after leaving Venezuela, and that would result in 11 people getting killed. This was effectively a crossing the Rubicon moment for a shift in American anti-cartel activity towards a more militaristic stance. Continued strikes would happen throughout September and October, with the first strike on Ecuadorian associated craft happening on October 16th, resulting in 2 being killed and 2 returning to Ecuador to face trial for their involvement. By the end of October, strikes had happened on both sides of South America, with escalations in the Pacific at the end of the month hitting multiple vessels, and one engagement seeing 3 strikes on a group of 4 boats. This pattern of increasing military activity would continue as 2025 gave way to 2026, with strikes in the Eastern Pacific appearing to be the priority in 2026, with a total of 8 vessels being struck in the region since the first of the year. This, of course, being compared to just 4 that had been struck in the Caribbean as of writing this episode, though, of course, who knows, by the time this actually goes out, there could be more. We will see. Now, these strikes have been the source of extensive international criticism, with objections being raised by the UN Human Rights Chief, who called for them to be stopped immediately, labeling them as unacceptable. And really, my friends, when we're going and talking about it, these critiques, in order to get to the meat of the issue about what makes the legal underpinnings of these strikes so complicated, is it's messy. The whole thing is really messy. Extrajudicial killings have always been a source of contention for the international community, with the drone strikes and the global war on terror being one of the largest influencers of doctrine on the topic. While both the United States and Ecuador have approved kinetic, which is to say physical strikes against cartel infrastructure, there is a need for legal discussion on the topic. This is in large part due to the legal classification of these cartels as terrorists, allowing them to be treated as enemy combatants, not civilians. Basically, the evidence used for this declaration is part of the structure that we talked about at the very beginning in this episode, and that's why we had to go into detail about it. Cartels oftentimes utilize sub-organizations and other affiliates, making it hard to tell where one group ends and another begins, unless you are intimately familiar with the players in the operation. This is further complicated by the ability and often tendency for cartels to engage in temporary politically motivated activity that blurs the line between their status as purely a criminal organization out to make money and those that are understood to be more ideological or have political goals. In our discussion on cartels in Mexico, especially in the wake of the El Mencho killing, it's easy to see the political nature of these cartels at times. At their most powerful, cartels can easily challenge, if not overwhelm, government structures that are meant to keep them in check. But does that mean that they are perpetually political? Or does that only apply in the moment that they're actually trying to do things? At what point does a political action supporting an economic outcome become mostly political or political enough to be declared terrorist action? The fluidity to which they slide on the whole gradient between politics and economics makes it hard to pin down exactly what came first, the economic egg or the drug trade or the political chicken that allows it to perpetuate. It's all kind of mixed together. Now, this may end up being a shortcoming of the international legal framework, which requires a lot more development as time goes on, but you can understand why that is a problem. While there is no clear and unified legal answer that provides perfect clarity on the overlapping laws, treaties, and conventions that govern the prosecution of these groups at the time that we're recording, the global response in large part has been to call for restraint. Just this past month, March of 2026, we saw the culmination of both the change in posture of the United States towards the drug cartels and the developing relationship between Presidents Trump and Naboa. On March 3rd, the United States and Ecuador would enter a new phase of joint land operations in Ecuador as a continuation and expansion of Operation Southern Spear. While pre-March involvement had been limited in Ecuador to surveillance and logistical support, with unconfirmed reports of U.S. Special Forces operating in the country, the extension of Operation Southern Spear allowed for significantly more American commitment to the country. Officially including Ecuador under their operational scope, American assets began more intense operations in support of Ecuadorian efforts. This occurred in tandem with a significant expansion of domestic Ecuadorian forces against the cartels, with 75,000 soldiers being deployed in March to four of the most impacted provinces in the southwestern portion of the country, which are now under a nightly curfew. As part of this initial crackdown, forces have destroyed 3 unspecified targets with artillery, with more to come in the coming weeks, I'm sure. It is worth noting that these provinces include the largest port in the country at Guayaquil, which may process up to 70% of the global cocaine supply. That is how big of a deal it is. What's interesting here is that despite the Ecuadorian troop buildup in the southwest, American strikes actually appear to be more focused on the northeast, on the Border Command, or the Comandos de la Frontera in Spanish. CDF, as the organization is known, is actually connected to FARC, which you'll remember from earlier was one of the first major narcotics organizations to set up shop in Ecuador. CDF formed as an offshoot of FARC that rejected the 2016 peace accord that ended fighting with the Colombian government. So far, we have limited information on these strikes, as the main body is still something that is classified. However, we do know of one strike that was supposed to have hit a training camp, but may have hit a dairy farm instead. It's all a little bit uncertain. In addition to the farm being destroyed, reports made to UN human rights workers suggest additional damage done by Ecuadorian soldiers to local residences, and abuses of farm workers in the area. Operations in the area are likely to continue, ramping up as we head into summer of 2026. We know that the FBI has gone to Ecuador for the first time and opened a permanent office at the US Embassy in Quito. This move indicates that the Trump administration has a long term focus on the region, intending to support, facilitate, or even outright carry out the prosecutions of transnational criminals and organizations. It is likely that a full commitment by the Trump administration would need to be a long term thing in focus as well. The decentralized and nuanced structures of the cartels, as we have gone over, makes dismantling the organization politically, militarily, and socially extremely tedious. In many instances, failing to tamp out a cartel entirely with one or a small number of raids or strikes simply leads to the formation of a new cartel under a survivor of the first organization, or just an opportunist with the ability to capitalize on the sudden power vacuum. I know I keep mentioning him, but we are seeing this now as I've gone over with El Mencho's CJNG cartel, and Fito, before his arrest, assumed his role in 2020 following the murder of Jorge Luis Zambrano. All of this stuff is something that happens all the time. And so, while reports of torture and the destruction of the farm are obviously inexcusable, I think this is something that we are likely to see more of as the campaign wages on and gets significantly more brutal. The decentralization of cartel infrastructure is designed to camouflage production facilities in typically remote areas as nothing more than your average civilian farm or other such structure, where on the ground corroboration may be difficult due to the nature of the population and their own relationship with the cartels. In other instances, cartels seem to be moving production into cities, which increases the risk of collateral damage and further misidentification. More recent developments also appear to suggest that over time, the system has broadened itself even further, with an almost warehousing process now present in some instances. Either finished narcotics or precursors are flown into a country, which then takes them by truck to another facility to then process them again in preparation for shipping as a larger order, and this just complicates things. The drug economy has grown in sophistication along with the traditional economy to make cartels regional, if not outright global organizations. And so now, here we are, in April of 2026. Clearly, the approach to anti cartel activity has re entered a phase of a more militaristic posture. This is not entirely unfounded, with the historic record showing an ebb and flow of violence in attempting to prosecute the war on drugs. In part, this is due to the violent nature of cartels and their relationship with both informal and formal power. With massive amounts of cash, weapons, and prestige, it's easy to see why cartel life might appeal to a population that is quite often on the short end of the global economic stick. When local instability meets the relative constant nature of the drug trade, it's no surprise that periods of extensive expansion for organized crime in Southern and Central America will take place during periods of economic or political uncertainty, like what you had with the Colombian conflict or the 2008 financial crisis or COVID. Really, all of these things just kind of work together. But I think in the end that if history shows us anything, it's that the approach to the question of the cartels is not something that can embody either entirely militaristic or entirely peaceful means. Countries like Colombia and Peru, in trying to deal with their own cartel problems, have found increasing success in programs that both disincentivize collaboration with the cartels through government support for voluntary crop changes to non precursor plants, and with the development of new economic opportunities through job programs and investments. This disincentivization is paired with a change in police focus to primarily disrupt or destroy the sites that process raw materials into narcotics rather than punish and attack the farmers themselves. And that dual approach to handling the issue ensures that not only are criminal elements removed, but the conditions that allowed them to take up residence in the first place are mitigated to prevent their return. While we are unlikely to see a reduction in military activity soon based on recent expansions of American troop commitments in the region, this cycle is likely to shift back again over time, just as it has in the past. That is the reality and why it is we spent so long going over this. But as the story continues to develop, we'll make sure to keep you informed here on the History of Everything. My friends, thank you all very much for listening, and we'll catch you here on the next one. I appreciate it. Let me know in the comment section down below what it is that we should cover next, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.